Alrighty, so welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at what they call the self-correcting mechanism of the economy. So, self-correcting mechanism, and this is for macroeconomics, and this is looking at a new classical approach. Alright, and so what we're going to do, let me just show you, ooh, not like that. Just in general what we're going to be looking at. So that's quantity GDP on the bottom, price level. We're going to have short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And just as kind of a refresher here, let me pick a line here. So we know that, we know that this is our output level right now. Okay, and we know that coming over here gives us the price level. So the only curve that we're missing missing here is the long run aggregate supply, and depending on where you draw that will tell you a lot as to where the economy's at. So let's take for instance that we drew the long run aggregate supply curve here. All right, what does that mean? All right, well remember the long run aggregate supply tells us where the level of full employment is, and so we know that we're at about 5% full employment here. And so if we're anywhere to the right of this, we would call this an inflationary gap. Inflation is starting to be a problem, and so unemployment in this area would be somewhere around 3%, 2%, because this is 5%, and anything to the right, as you move to the right, unemployment goes down because you're producing more and you need more people to produce. And as you move to the left, then unemployment goes up because that means GDP is going down. We don't need as many people to produce. And so if I plop this line down here, I'm drawing an inflationary gap. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Or if I plop this line down over here, now that means here's full employment, which is 5%. And so if the equilibrium is to the left of full employment, then that means that we are probably we are in a recession. Most likely in a recession, definitely a contraction, because GDP is moving down. And so if this is a 5% unemployment rate here at full employment, then we would say that here we're somewhere around 7 or 8 or 9% unemployment. So the other place that you can draw this is right there, okay, and pretend those intersect, and that would say that we are at full employment. Generally things are going pretty well. So anyway, so what I want to do today is to show you the argument for how the economy can tend to correct itself. All right, what forces would get the economy to do to move back towards equilibrium? Okay, because the new classical argument is that the economy wants to get back to equilibrium. All right, and sometimes they would argue that the government gets in the way, but so here we go. So let's say that we have a decrease in aggregate demand. So something happens out there in the world. And remember, aggregate demand is simply C plus I plus G plus NX. All right, and so if any of these factors falls, then it would shift aggregate demand back to the left. And so let's say that consumer spending falls. All right, remember, consumer spending makes up somewhere around 70% of the economy. So if that falls even a little bit, it's going to have a bigger impact. So anyway, so we're over here, and aggregate demand falls. Let me make that a YF, because that's our full employment level. And that was Y1. So it falls, and now we're at Y2. All right, and so we know that what's happened in the economy. So decrease in aggregate demand has led to a decrease in GDP. All right, because we moved from here to here. All right, if GDP is going down, then we can say that unemployment is going up. All right, because we're not producing as many goods. And so if we're not producing as many goods, then we don't need as many people to work, and people are going to get laid off. And that's what we'll get to know as cyclical unemployment. And then also, so that happened down here. And then also we can see that the price level went down. So we have a decrease in the price level. All right, so the question is, how would, if the government doesn't get involved, how would the economy fix itself? Because if the government got involved, then we would just say, look, this is, again, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus NX. And coming at it from a Keynesian argument, we would say, look, if the economy is bad, then we need we need spending, and since consumers and businesses may not be spending, then the government needs to jack it up, and so that would theoretically push this back up to the right. All right, now we're not going to use the Keynesian argument, we're going to use this new classical argument as to how the economy would tend to fix itself. All right, let me get rid of all this stuff. Bear with me. I should write in cursive, that way it would all be one, just one undo. So, all right, so what we want to look at is what's going to cause either, we want to get back to somewhere on this line, somewhere on the long run aggregate supply curve, because that's the argument that if left to its own devices, the economy will come back and fix itself. So let's take a look at the short run aggregate supply. All right. And which way would this short run curve have to shift? Remember, we're sitting here. Which way would the short run curve have to shift to get us back to the level of full employment? All right, so if we shifted it to the left, then that's just going to bring us up here, and that's not what we want to have happen. So it would have to be a rightward shift. All right, let me do this in kind of a lighter color. All right, and so what would cause a short run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right? And so in the new classical argument, they're assuming that wages, oh, don't want that. In the new classical argument, they're assuming that wages are flexible. All right, and that they can go down or they can go up, and but that they are flexible downward. And so this is kind of key in understanding how this economy would tend to correct itself. And so if we think that, if we take that for an assumption for now, that wages are flexible, then what would happen as unemployment goes up to wages themselves? And the answer is, if you have more people now competing for the fewer jobs that are out there, then people would be willing to take, because of competition between workers, that they would be willing to take a lower wage. And so generally, with the short run aggregate supply, we would tend to see a decrease in wages, which will lead to an increase in the short run aggregate supply, because that's simply a cost to business. Anything that changes the cost of a business will shift this short run aggregate supply. So if wages go down, then we would expect to see the short run aggregate supply curve shift, and it may not shift all this much, but, and so the argument is that because of unemployment, wages are flexible downward. Again, this is the key to this whole thing, that wages are flexible downward, and so the high unemployment will lead to an increase in the short run aggregate supply through a reduction in wages. Now, the other argument is that wages aren't as flexible downward right now because we have things like minimum wage, and we have things like unemployment benefits. And so in purely a theoretical model, if we got rid of these things, then wages would be more flexible downward. And so, you know, if you're looking at the argument today and you look at wages and say, you know what, they don't seem to come down very fast, then the counter argument would be that you're right, but if government got out of it and took away minimum wage and took away unemployment benefits, then wages would indeed speed up their progression towards adjustment. Okay, so whether it's adjusting down in one case or adjusting up in another. So anyway, that's the argument for the short run side of it. And now, what about the aggregate demand? So we shifted that, and let me erase that just a little bit because I don't want it to be quite that much. All right, so let's go there. Fill that back in. And so let's say that the short run aggregate supply curve moved here. All right, so that's still a short run aggregate supply. Put it all in the same color, 2. All right, so we had to shift this way. Now, what about aggregate demand? What would cause aggregate demand to increase on its own? Because we know that to get back to equilibrium, aggregate demand is going to have to increase. And so this is what we want to look at, the price level. And it all gets back to interest rates. So there's this formula, N equals I plus pi E. All right, and so the N is the nominal interest rate, And the nominal interest rate is just simply what you and I go get when we go to the bank and borrow money. So if you go to the bank and buy a house, they'll give you the nominal interest rate. If you borrow money to buy a car, then you get the nominal interest rate. And so where does that number come from? All right, it comes from taking this I, which is the real interest rate, and this is what banks this is the profit for banks. All right, this is how they compete. So when we talk about the cost of money, and that's really all an interest rate is, simply tells us the cost of borrowing money. This is the cost of borrowing the money. All right, and so you might ask yourself, well, if this is the cost, then why isn't this the cost? And so just real quick, without making this a lesson in interest rates themselves, uh, let's say that I borrow $100 at 5%. All right, and the bank wants to make 5%. So this is the I. All right, and so at the end of the year, I pay them back $105. And so you'd say, okay, well, what's the problem? Because they charged you 5%, you gave them $105 back, they made their 5%, and so that's what this I represents. And if the banks wanted to compete with each other, they wanted my business more, then they would make this 4% or 3%. But that's what we're talking about with this is the cost of money. So the question is, if I give them back $105, all right, they have made an extra $5, but what if inflation had gone up by 10%? All right, are they happy with this $105? And the answer is obviously no, because if we take this original $100 and we just applied inflation to it, the purchasing power, you'd need $110 to have the same purchasing power as this 100. All right, and so if I only gave them $105 back and inflation was 10%, they're actually losing money. They're not only are they not making a profit, but they're losing money in the process. And so what they would want to say is, okay, look, we need to figure out what the expected rate of inflation is going to be, and if it's 10%, then we need to tack that on, and that's what this pi e is, expected inflation. And the Federal Reserve kind of gives everybody that number, so expected inflation. All right, and so if we think that it's going to be 10%, then we need to add that into the interest rate. And so coming down here, we know that they want to make 5% on their 5% profit. All right, so that's where this 5% is, up here. And then we'd say, okay, well, what's the expected rate of inflation? And if it's 10%, which would be very high for us, then they're going to say, okay, for me to give you a loan, I'm going to have to charge you 15% because I want to make 5% in profit, and we know that 10% of that money is going to be eaten up by inflation. And so in order to get a 5% rate of return, we need to charge you 15%. All right, and so that's the story with interest rates, and this one is an important story. So let me leave it up. And so with aggregate demand, as you see here, if we have a decrease in aggregate demand, what happens to the price level? And the price level is simply a measure of inflation, whether you're using the CPI or the GDP deflator. And so if the price level is going down, then what would you expect to happen to this expected rate of inflation? And so if we have a decreasing price level, that's decreasing inflation or deflation, then we would expect to see that number come down. And so instead of 10%, what if it drops to 5%? All right, now what is the bank going to charge me? They still get to keep their 5% profit, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but now they would only have to charge me 10%. All right, so interest rates are the issue here. And so if we look at interest rates, if interest rates go down, will consumers want to spend more? And the answer is yes, because we'll want to buy things like cars, washers and dryers, televisions, any consumer good that requires us to borrow money. How about business investments? Well, the only consumer good really that that consumers buy that fall under business investments are homes. And so this would be a good time to buy a house. Businesses want to invest in a lot more capital. Government spending, it's now cheaper for the government to borrow money. So if they're anything like they have been in the last, 200 years, they're probably going to take that as an advantage, as an opportunity to go out and borrow some more money. So we'd expect to see government spending go up. And then net exports are going to go up because in a conversation that we're not going to have here, it's going to end up causing, if interest rates are falling, the demand for the dollar will go down, which means it becomes cheaper. And so people are going to want to buy more of our stuff, and that'll be a separate video. So anyway, so if the interest rates do indeed go down, then what would you expect to have happen to aggregate demand? So we would see an increase in consumption, business investments, possibly government spending, and net exports, and all of that will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And so we would say that aggregate demand, let's come back over here. How about we use the same color? So we have, and so we'll see an increase in aggregate demand, so it'll push that way. And so what we end up with is, through a change in wages, which will increase short-run aggregate supply shifted to the right, and a decrease in interest rates, which will cause consumer spending to rise, business investments, government spending, and net exports, all those will go up. So we're going to see a shift to the right of short-run aggregate supply, a shift to the right of aggregate demand, and theoretically we will come back somewhere there. All right. Again, that's theory. Now, let me reference back one real quick. We were talking about this real interest rate. Is that going to stay at 5%? And so you might want to look at it and say, you know what? If we're in a recession and banks really want your money, then would you expect to see any competition around this real interest rate? And so one bank might say, you know what? We really want to make some loans. We haven't had as many people coming to borrow money as we did however long ago because of this recession. And so instead of 5%, we're going to charge maybe 4.5%. All right. And another bank may say, you know what, we can do one better than that. We'll go down to 4. And so the banks would, this is where they would compete for your business based on the real rate. And so they're all generally going to use the same expected rate of inflation, but this is what the banks have control over, this real rate of return. All right, and so we might see forces pulling the expected rate of inflation down, and we might see forces pulling the real interest rates down. And so if both of those go down, then this may drop to 4% or whatever it is. Okay, it'll be lower, and a lower rate generally causes aggregate demand to shift out to the right. All right. So this is how the economy would correct itself with a decrease in aggregate demand. All right. So this is quite a mess here, but hopefully you followed along. Let me just do the other one real quick. And get you start clean. So this is new classical self-correcting mechanism. This will be a lot quicker because everything is just in reverse. And so we did a recessionary gap. This is since it moved here, all right, it's a recessionary gap. We'll talk about what we mean by gap. It's just simply the gap between full employment and the potential GDP and real GDP. All right, so now we're going to do an inflationary gap. Inflationary gap. So let's draw the long run in. Long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Aggregate, let's make it a little more extreme than that. Always easier to teach when you use extreme examples. All right, so aggregate demand there. Here's our level of full employment, quantity, GDP, price level, PL. And so something's happened. Let's say that aggregate demand was down here. So something's happened that causes aggregate demand to shift up. All right, and so here we are at Y1. So let's look at the short run aggregate supply curve. And so if inflation's going way up, then remember, we're assuming that a lot of people are under contracts. And so if inflation starts to go up, what's going to happen to wages? All right. Well, I know that if inflation were to go up 50% at the end of this year, then I would go to my boss and say, you know what, I really need a raise because I can't afford to buy the stuff that I've been buying for the last 3 years because the prices have gone up. And so if indeed wages were flexible, all right, who has the upper hand here when unemployment is very low? Because that's what we're talking about. Remember, this is 5% unemployment, so anything to the right is lower than 5. So we'll say this is 2%. All right. I don't know if we've ever hit 2% outside of a wartime, but anyway, if it was 2%, then you'd say that workers have the upper hand because there's just not as many available workers to take the jobs, and so they have a little more say in what's going to happen to their wages. And so typically, if we're in this inflationary period, we would expect to see wages rise. All right, and so if wages rose, then that would cause a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply. And so let's draw it over here, and I'm not going to shift it all the way back because we're going to mess with aggregate demand in a minute. So there's a short-run aggregate supply. This is 2. All right, and so they shift to the left because of the inflationary pressures cause wages to rise. All right, now what about aggregate demand? Go back to blue. Equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And so aggregate demand, again, the price level is going up. So remember our equation, interest rates, N equals I plus pi E. So this is the expected rate of inflation. This is measuring inflation. So if that's going up, that's going up. All right. And if that's going up, that causes that to go up. So we'd say that interest rates are rising. An increase in interest rates will cause consumers to buy less, businesses to buy less. Governments, they're still going to spend a bunch. And net exports will go down because we're going to actually have a strengthening dollar. So we would see a decrease in consumption, investment, net exports, and in a fairy tale land, government spending. So anyway, with those things going down, all of these will cause a decrease in the aggregate demand. And let's draw that in. And that's going to come right around in here. So we'll say 82. All right, so everything shifts back, and the argument is that it will move back towards equilibrium. All right, and so this is how the economy would correct itself. If the government weren't involved, these things theoretically would flow a lot easier. Wages would be a lot more flexible. Prices would be more flexible. So let's just take a real quick review. This is going to be kind of a mess here, but we ended up going here, so we were in a recession, and we wanted to say, okay, what's going to cause it to get back to equilibrium, back to long-run aggregate supply, which would be an equilibrium. And so we know that aggregate demand will come back to the right because of the decrease in interest rates. All right, decrease in interest rates causes consumer spending and all that stuff to shift to the right. We also know that we're making the assumption, this is the big assumption for the new classical model, that wages that they're flexible downwards, and so if wages fall, then short run shifts to the right. And so through the combination of short run, let me just highlight it. I know it's a mess, I apologize. So we know that here was our new short run curve, here was our new aggregate demand curve, and we ended up there. All right, so that's a recessionary, that's how to correct for a recession. And over here, much cleaner, we had an inflationary gap, and so if we have an inflationary gap, then we would expect to see wages rise, which would cause short and aggregate supply curve to shift left. We'd also anticipate that the nominal rate is going to go up because the expected rate of inflation, so here's our price level, causes the expected rate of inflation to go up, which causes nominal rate to go up, and this is the rate that you and I have. And so if the nominal rate goes up, we'd expect to see consumers and businesses and net exports and government spending all to go down. All right, and when that happens, we would see a drawback in aggregate demand, and so all of the forces ended up getting us back to equilibrium. So shifting short-run supply to the left, shifting aggregate demand to the left. So that is the idea of the self-correcting mechanism and how that all works. All right, the aggregate demand hinges on the interest rate, and short-run aggregate supply curve hinges on wages. All right, so until next time, I hope you enjoyed.